The war had been lost before it even truly began. Humanity, for all its pride and ambition, had been outmatched in every way. The Zal-Zir, an empire of cold-blooded conquerors, descended upon the Sol system with fleets so vast they blotted out the stars. Their ships, sleek and cruel, moved with impossible precision, tearing apart Earth's defenses as if swatting insects. Earth's military had put up a brave fight. They launched every weapon they had, sent out every last warship, but it wasn't enough. The colonies on Mars and Titan had already fallen, and now the final stand was being waged in Earth's orbit. The end was inevitable. And yet, deep within the ruins of humanity's last shipyard, floating among the shattered remains of the fleet, there was one vessel still intact. Not a battleship, not a dreadnought, not even a proper warship. It was the Hope's Dawn. An old, barely functioning cargo hauler, originally meant to transport mining equipment between the asteroid belt and Earth. The ship was outdated, slow, and completely unarmed. It was never built for war, but it was the only thing left. Inside, a handful of survivors crowded into the dimly lit bridge. The atmosphere was tense, filled with the sharp smell of burnt circuitry and fear. Captain Elias Vance, a man who had once commanded one of Earth's most powerful cruisers, now stood at the helm of this rusting relic. His once pristine uniform was torn, stained with blood and sweat. "This is a suicide mission," grumbled Lieutenant Renner, the ship's only engineer, as he frantically worked to keep the ship's engines running. "Even if we could run, we wouldn't get far. The moment we fire up these thrusters, the Zal-Zir will spot us." "We don't have a choice," Elias said, his voice firm but weary. "If we stay, we die. If we run, we might still die, but at least we'll die fighting." A heavy silence filled the room. Everyone knew the odds. The Hope's Dawn was nothing more than a floating piece of scrap metal, but it carried something more valuable than firepower. It carried the last of humanity's knowledge, its history, and its only chance at survival. Deep in the ship's cargo hold, hundreds of data cores were stored, blueprints for advanced weapons, scientific discoveries, and genetic archives of every species on Earth. If even a single Zal-Zir got their hands on this data, humanity would be erased, not just physically, but from history itself. A soft beeping broke the silence. Ensign Lee, the youngest member of the crew, paled as she checked the sensors. "They found us," she whispered. Elias turned to the main screen. A single Zal-Zir warship was approaching, its sleek hull gliding through the debris field like a shark hunting wounded prey. It wasn't the largest ship in the enemy fleet, but it didn't need to be. Even their smallest ships were deadly enough to destroy entire cities. "Get us moving," Elias ordered. Renner cursed under his breath but obeyed, forcing the old thrusters to life. The Hope's Dawn lurched forward, metal groaning in protest. It was slow. Too slow. The Zal-Zir ship fired a warning shot, a pulse of blue energy slicing past them, close enough to make the whole vessel shudder. "They're toying with us," Lee murmured, hands trembling over the controls. "They know we can't escape." Elias clenched his fists. "Not unless we give them a reason to think otherwise." He turned to Renner. "Do we have anything? Anything at all? That we can use as a weapon?" Renner scoffed. "Unless you plan on throwing wrenches at them, we've got nothing." Elias's gaze darkened. "Then we'll have to improvise." Another warning shot. Closer this time. The Zal-Zir were done playing. Elias took a deep breath. "Lee, set a course for the asteroid field. If we can't outgun them, we'll outmaneuver them." Renner shook his head. In this piece of junk? We won't last 5 minutes in there. Elias stared at the screen, watching the enemy ship grow closer. Then we'll have to make those 5 minutes count. The Hope's Dawn shuddered violently as it forced its way toward the asteroid field. The engines whined in protest, barely holding together as Renner pushed them to their limit. The ship wasn't built for high-speed maneuvers, and everyone on board knew it, but they had no other choice. The Zalzir warship followed, gliding effortlessly through the debris field. Its sleek, predatory design allowed it to maneuver with ease, unlike the sluggish hauler struggling ahead of it. A deep, guttural voice crackled over the ship's dying comms. "Human vessel, you have no weapons, no defenses. Surrender now, and we will grant you a swift death." Elias gritted his teeth. He knew that was a lie. The Zalzir didn't grant mercy. If they were captured, they'd be tortured for information, their bodies dissected, their existence erased. He had seen what they had done to other ships that had tried to surrender. "Captain, we're not going to last in here!" Renner shouted, his hands flying across the console as warning lights flickered in red. "These thrusters weren't meant for this kind of stress." "We don't need to last," Elias replied. "We just need to be smart." The asteroid field loomed ahead, a chaotic graveyard of jagged rocks tumbling through space. It was a death trap for any ship that couldn't navigate quickly, but that was exactly what Elias was counting on. "Lee, bring us in close to those larger asteroids," he ordered. Lee's fingers shook as she adjusted the course. "We're barely holding together as it is." "Do it." The ship lurched again as it dipped into the field, weaving dangerously close to a massive chunk of rock. The Hope's Dawn had no shields to protect it from impact. If they miscalculated even once, they'd be reduced to scrap. The Zalzir ship pursued, staying just far enough behind to avoid the larger asteroids. It was clear they weren't in a hurry. They were hurting the humans, waiting for them to make a mistake. "They're playing with us," Renner muttered, "like a cat with a dying mouse." Elias ignored him. His mind was racing, searching for anything they could use. They had no weapons, no shields, and no speed advantage. But what they did have was the environment. A plan formed in his mind. It was insane, ridiculous even, but it was their only shot. "Lee, find me an asteroid big enough to cause a chain reaction." She blinked. "Wait, you're not suggesting—" "I am." She hesitated, scanning the field, then pointed to a massive rock drifting ahead. "That one. If we hit it at the right angle, the impact will send debris scattering in every direction." "Perfect," Elias said. "Renner, how much fuel do we have left in the emergency thrusters?" Renner frowned. "Enough for one last desperate push. Maybe." "That's all we need." The Zalzir ship was gaining. They had run out of time. "On my mark," Elias said, gripping the edge of his seat. "Lee, keep us steady. Renner, prepare to fire the thrusters at full burn." The asteroid loomed closer. The timing had to be perfect. The enemy ship adjusted its position, preparing to fire the final shot. Elias took a deep breath. "Now!" Renner slammed the controls. The Hope's Dawn jerked violently as the emergency thrusters fired, sending the ship spiraling to the side, just in time to avoid a direct hit from the Zalzir's plasma cannons. But the real trick was what happened next. The sudden burst of energy sent the Hope's Dawn hurtling toward the massive asteroid. For a moment, it seemed like they were on a collision course. Then, at the last possible second, Lee twisted the controls, narrowly avoiding impact. The Zalzir ship wasn't so lucky. The asteroid, disturbed by the sudden force, shifted in space. A second later, a massive chunk broke off and smashed into the enemy vessel. The impact sent it careening off course, directly into another cluster of rocks. The asteroid field came alive with chaos. Boulders, some the size of buildings, shattered and spun wildly. The Zalzir ship tried to recover, but it was too late. Another asteroid struck, then another. The once majestic warship was torn apart, its hull breaking into fiery fragments. Elias exhaled, his chest rising and falling with adrenaline. Lai was the first to break the silence. Did we just destroy a Zalzir warship? With a cargo hauler? Renner let out a breathless laugh. I don't believe it. Elias didn't smile. He knew this was only the beginning. We bought ourselves time, he said grimly. But they'll come looking, and next time, they won't play with their prey. The Hope's dawn drifted through the field, battered but still intact. Somewhere beyond the asteroids, more Zalzir ships were waiting, and Elias knew they couldn't run forever. But for now, humanity still had hope, and he wasn't about to let it die. The Hope's dawn drifted through the chaos of the asteroid field, its engines sputtering as they tried to stabilize. The ship's battered hull groaned under the strain, but against all odds, it was still flying. The Zalzir warship was gone, crushed beneath the very debris it had forced them into. For the first time since Earth fell, Elias felt the faintest glimmer of hope. But it wouldn't last. Captain, Lee's voice was tight with fear as she stared at the flickering sensor readout. That ship we destroyed, it sent out a distress beacon before it was crushed. Elias's stomach turned to ice. Renner cursed. Of course it did. Bastards never fight alone. Reinforcements will be here in minutes. Elias straightened, his mind already racing for options. The Hope's dawn had survived the first encounter by pure desperation and luck. They wouldn't be so fortunate a second time. How bad is the damage? He asked. Renner shot him a look. Where do you want me to start? The thrusters are fried, the navigation systems are barely hanging on, and we're leaking oxygen in 3 different sections. We've got maybe an hour before we run out of breathable air. And the cargo? Renner hesitated. Still intact. But if we lose pressure, it won't matter. All that data, all that history, wiped out just like the rest of us. Elias clenched his jaw. That couldn't happen. The Hope's dawn wasn't just a ship. It was the last lifeline of the human race. If they died, humanity died with them. He turned back to the sensors. The asteroid field had given them cover once before. Maybe it could again. Lee, are there any pockets inside this field we can hide in? She scanned the readout, her brow furrowed. There's a cluster of ice asteroids about 60,000 kilometers ahead. They're cold enough to mask our heat signature, but... But? Lee hesitated. They're unstable. If we hit one too hard, it could crack open and send 1,000 shards slicing through the ship. Renner let out a dry laugh. Great. We either get blown apart by the Zalzir or turn ourselves into space shrapnel. Elias ignored the cynicism. It's our best chance. Take us in. Lee swallowed hard, but nodded, easing the ship toward the icy cluster. The Hope's dawn moved sluggishly, every engine struggling to keep up. Elias could feel the tension in the crew, the unspoken understanding that they were on borrowed time. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. The asteroid field loomed ahead, massive chunks of frozen rock spinning slowly in the void. Some were the size of houses, others the size of entire cities. If they could wedge themselves deep enough inside the cluster, the Zalzir scanners wouldn't be able to pick them up. Elias watched the countdown timer. Any moment now, enemy reinforcements would arrive. They slipped between the first few ice formations, the ship's hull groaning from the cold. Frost spread across the outer panels, the temperature sensors dropping rapidly. It was working. The ship's heat signature was fading. Just a little further, Elias murmured. Lee adjusted the trajectory, weaving carefully through the maze of frozen death. Every second felt like an eternity. Then the alarms blared. "Contacts inbound," Lee gasped. "Multiple Zalzir warships, cruisers, frigates, coming in fast." Elias felt his breath hitch. "How long until they reach us?" "Less than a minute." The Hope's dawn was still too close to open space. If the Zalzir scanned the area now, they'd be exposed. Renner gritted his teeth. "We need to go deeper, now." Lee didn't hesitate this time. She fired the last reserve of power into the engines, sending the ship surging forward. The Hope's dawn dove into the thickest part of the ice cluster, the frozen masses closing around them like a tomb. The Zalzir ships arrived moments later. Elias held his breath as the alien vessels spread out, scanning the area. Their sleek black hulls contrasted sharply against the ice, moving with eerie precision. A voice crackled through the comms, a guttural growl, thick with contempt. "The human vessel was here. Find it." Renner tensed. "If they bring out pulse scanners, we're done." Elias nodded grimly. Pulse scanners would penetrate even the ice's interference. It was only a matter of time before the Zalzir used them, and when they did, the hunt would begin. The Hope's dawn sat frozen in place, hidden within the thick cluster of ice asteroids. The ship's systems were running on emergency power, keeping heat emissions as low as possible. Every breath inside the cramped bridge felt like it echoed too loudly, every heartbeat a countdown to discovery. Outside, the Zalzir ships prowled like predators sniffing for wounded prey. Their dark hulls glided through space, scanning, waiting, listening. Elias watched them from the dim glow of the failing monitor, his fingers tightening into fists. They had avoided immediate destruction, but they weren't safe. Not yet. "Their scans are intensifying," Lee whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "They're looking for any heat signatures, energy fluctuations, anything unusual." Renner let out a slow exhale. "We're a floating chunk of scrap metal in a frozen graveyard. We just need to stay quiet." Elias didn't respond. He knew it wasn't that simple. The Zalzir weren't stupid. They had seen the debris of their destroyed warship. They knew something had killed it, and they wouldn't leave without finding out what. Minutes stretched into eternity. One of the Zalzir ships drifted closer. Too close. Elias could see its sleek hull, the glowing alien symbols that marked its name, the small ports on its underside that could unleash devastating plasma fire. His pulse quickened. If they fired at random, if they so much as got suspicious. A deep, guttural voice came through their comms again. "The humans are here. They think they can hide. They always try." Renner's jaw clenched. "They're taunting us." "They're baiting us," Elias corrected. The Zalzir ship hovered near the ice field. A sudden pulse rippled outward, like a wave passing through space. A scanning pulse. Elias's gut twisted. If that pulse detected even the faintest energy signature. The console flickered. The ship's emergency power briefly spiked. Elias's blood ran cold. Lee saw it too. Her fingers flew across the controls, trying to suppress the fluctuation, but it was too late. The Zalzir ship stopped. Then it turned. A bright blue glow built along its weapons array. "They found us," Lee whispered. Elias didn't hesitate. Brace for impact! The first shot struck the ice around them. A blinding explosion sent frozen shards flying in all directions. The Hope's Dawn lurched violently, its hull groaning in protest. Another blast followed, sending a shockwave that rattled the ship's insides. "They're trying to shake us loose!" Renner shouted. Elias gritted his teeth. They couldn't afford to stay put anymore. If they didn't move now, the Zalzir would rip the entire ice cluster apart to find them. "Lee, full thrusters, now!" Lee slammed the controls. The Hope's Dawn roared to life, its thrusters burning as it shot forward. The ship burst out from its frozen cover, spinning through the asteroid field at dangerous speeds. The Zalzir didn't hesitate. They opened fire. Plasma bolts seared past them, missing by inches. The Hope's Dawn twisted and turned through the chaos, dodging between massive asteroids. One of the enemy ships was in direct pursuit, weaving through the frozen debris like a shadow. "They're closing in!" Renner yelled. "We can't outrun them forever!" Elias's mind raced. They had no weapons, no shields, nothing that could win them a fight. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to win. They just needed to make the Zalzir lose. "Lee, steer us toward the densest part of the ice field." Lee hesitated for only a second before angling the ship downward, diving deeper into the frozen labyrinth. The Hope's Dawn weaved dangerously between jagged ice formations, flying inches from certain destruction. The Zalzir ship followed. Elias watched the enemy closely. It was fast, faster than them, but it was also bigger, less maneuverable. It wasn't built to chase prey through tight spaces. He just needed to exploit that weakness. "Lee, when I say now, cut all thrusters and let inertia carry us forward." She frowned. "What?" "That'll make us a sitting duck. Just trust me." Lee swallowed hard but nodded. The ship hurtled toward a narrow gap between two massive ice formations. The Zalzir ship was right on their tail, plasma cannons charging for a final shot. Elias watched the distance close. Closer, closer. "Now!" Lee killed the engines. The Hope's Dawn instantly lost power, momentum carrying it forward in eerie silence. The Zalzir ship, expecting them to keep accelerating, miscalculated. It moved too fast, too aggressively. By the time the Zalzir pilot realized what had happened, it was too late. The massive ship slammed into an ice formation at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. Ice shattered, alien metal buckled, and a blinding explosion lit up the field. The Hope's Dawn tumbled forward, spinning from the shock wave, but it was still intact. Elias gripped the armrest of his chair, breathing hard. They had survived. Again. But as Lee steadied the ship and Renner caught his breath, another warning flashed on the console. More ships inbound. Bigger ones. The Zalzir weren't just hunting anymore. They were coming to exterminate. Elias exhaled slowly. They couldn't run. They couldn't fight. But maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to end this. For good. The Hope's Dawn drifted in the wake of the explosion, its hull battered but intact. The ice field around them was no longer a safe haven. It was a shattered battlefield, chunks of frozen rock spinning wildly through the void. They had destroyed one Zalzir ship, but now more were coming. Bigger ones. Elias sat stiff in his chair, staring at the warning lights flashing across the console. "Lee," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "How long until the new contacts reach us?" She swallowed hard, scanning the sensors. 2 minutes. Maybe less. Renner slammed his fist against the panel. "We can't run. We can't hide. We've used every trick in the book, And they still won't stop coming. Elias didn't argue. Renner was right. Every time they survived, the Zalzir sent bigger ships, more forces. The Hope's Dawn had nothing left. No weapons, no reinforcements, no escape routes. But it did still have one thing. "We stop running," Elias said. Renner blinked. "What?" Elias turned to face him. "We stop running. We take the fight to them." Renner let out a bitter laugh. "Take the fight to them? With what? We've got no guns, no shields, no—" "We have this," Elias interrupted, gesturing to the cargo hold. "The archives. The last of humanity's knowledge." Lee furrowed her brow. "What does that have to do with fighting back?" Elias leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "The Zalzir don't just want to kill us. They want to erase us. Wipe us from history. They fear the knowledge we carry, because if we survive, humanity survives. That's why they've been so relentless." Lee's face paled. "You're saying if they can't have the archives, they'll do anything to destroy them?" "Exactly," Elias said. "So we make sure they can't. We don't run anymore. We make them chase us, straight into their own destruction." Renner frowned. "And how exactly do we do that?" Elias pointed at the flickering navigation screen. "There's a gas giant nearby, isn't there?" Lee hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, a massive one. Storm strong enough to rip ships apart." Elias's voice hardened. "We lead the Zalzir straight into it." A tense silence filled the bridge. Renner rubbed his forehead. "You want us to fly into a storm that can crush battleships?" Elias's jaw clenched. "It's the only way. If we go in, they'll follow. And if we time it right, we can use the turbulence to throw them off while we slip away." Lee's fingers tightened around the controls. "Or we die." Elias nodded grimly. "Or we die." A new alert flashed. "Incoming!" Lee shouted. 3 warships, closing fast!" Elias straightened. "Set a course for the gas giant, maximum speed." Lee hesitated for only a second before obeying. The Hope's Dawn groaned as its engines flared, pushing forward toward the swirling storm ahead. Behind them, the Zalzir ships followed. They had taken the bait. Now all that was left was to see if the plan would work, or if this would be the end of humanity's last hope. The Hope's Dawn hurtled toward the gas giant, its engines barely holding together under the strain. The planet loomed ahead, a swirling maelstrom of deep red and violent gold, its storms so massive they could swallow entire fleets. The sheer gravity of it was terrifying, an inescapable abyss of chaos and destruction. Behind them, the Zalzir ships pursued relentlessly. 3 warships, sleek and merciless, their weapons primed to fire the moment the humans made a mistake. Elias stood rigid, his eyes locked on the growing storm. "How long until we hit the outer atmosphere?" Lee's hands flew over the controls. 45 seconds. Renner let out a shaky breath. "And how long until the pressure crushes us?" She didn't answer. Elias already knew. They weren't built for this. No human ship was. But the Zalzir weren't built for it either. A bright flash illuminated the rear cameras, an energy blast screaming past them, missing by meters. "They're getting desperate," Renner muttered. "Good," Elias said. "Let them be." The ship rattled as it crossed into the planet's outermost layer. Winds howled against the hull, and the first turbulence hit like a hammer. The Hope's Dawn jolted hard to the left, warning sirens blaring across the bridge. "Hold it steady!" Elias barked. Lee gritted her teeth, fighting the controls. "Trying!" The ship bucked again, metal straining under the force. The Zalzir ships followed, but even they weren't immune to the growing instability. The lead warship dipped too low into the swirling winds, struggling to correct its trajectory. Elias saw his moment. "Lee, kill the engines. Let the storm take us." Renner's eyes went wide. "Are you insane?" But Lee understood. The thrusters cut out, and suddenly the Hope's dawn was weightless, no longer flying, just falling. The Zalzir weren't expecting it. The lead warship, still under full thrust, shot forward uncontrollably, dipping too deep into the storm. The pressure slammed into it like a fist, tearing at its hull. Lightning flashed across the planet's sky, and in the next instant, the ship snapped, ripped apart by the very forces they had underestimated. Elias exhaled. One down. The remaining two warships hesitated. Their movements became cautious, uncertain. Good. But they weren't done yet. "We're losing altitude fast," Lee warned. "Another few minutes and we will be crushed." Elias's mind raced. They needed a way out. Fast. Then an idea struck. "Lee, bring up the gas composition of this planet." She frowned but obeyed. A complex readout appeared on the screen. Hydrogen, ammonia, methane, and... Elias's eyes narrowed. Oxygen pockets. Not enough to sustain life, but enough to ignite. A new plan formed, reckless and desperate. "Renner, do we have anything left in the fuel reserves?" Renner scowled. "Barely anything. Maybe a short burst." "That's all we need." Elias turned to Lee. "Find us the densest pocket of flammable gas you can." Her eyes widened. "Wait. You're not seriously... We're going to set this planet on fire." For a moment, there was silence. Then Renner let out a low whistle. "You're insane." Elias's expression was grim. "You have a better idea?" Renner exhaled sharply. "Fine. Let's light a goddamn planet up." Lee's fingers moved fast, locking in coordinates. "Found a dense oxygen pocket below. But if we go too deep, we'll never get out." Elias nodded. "We won't have to." The Hope's dawn dove hard, piercing deeper into the storm. The ship groaned under the increasing pressure, alarms screaming across every system. The Zalzir ships followed, hesitant but unwilling to let their prey escape. Elias watched them close in, perfect. "Renner, on my mark. Fire the last of our thrusters straight up." Renner's hands hovered over the controls. "You better time this right, Captain." Elias's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The ship raced toward the oxygen pocket, wind and gas swirling violently around them. The Zalzir ships moved to match their speed. Closer, closer. "Now!" Renner slammed the controls. The Hope's dawn roared as its engines burst to life, shooting upward in a sharp, violent ascent. The sudden shift sent both Zalzir ships downward, straight into the densest part of the gas field. Elias didn't wait. "Lee, dump our remaining fuel, all of it." Lee hesitated for only a second before executing the command. A stream of burning hot fuel jettisoned behind them, mixing with the unstable gases. Elias sucked in a breath, and then he pressed the emergency ignition. A single spark. That was all it took. The explosion ignited instantly, a massive chain reaction that turned the entire section of the storm into a raging inferno. Fire erupted behind them, a swirling, consuming force that engulfed both Zalzir ships before they could react. They vanished, swallowed whole by the firestorm. The shockwave hit the Hope's dawn like a tsunami, throwing it upward, out of the storm's pull. Metal creaked, pressure systems wailed, and then silence. The ship drifted, free of the gas giant's grip. Lee's breathing was ragged. Renner slumped back in his chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. Elias exhaled, shoulders sinking. The Zalzir were gone. They had won. Not with weapons, not with an army, with a single broken-down cargo hauler and the will to survive. Lee let out a shaky laugh. We just destroyed an entire Zalzir fleet. With fire, Renner wiped sweat from his brow. Remind me to never question one of your crazy plans again. Elias didn't smile, because he knew this wasn't the end. They had survived today. But the Zalzir would hear of this, and when they came back, they wouldn't just send warships. They'd send everything. Elias turned toward the distant stars. The Hope's dawn still carried the last remnants of humanity's knowledge, their last hope. And if they were to survive what was coming next, they would need more than just luck. They would need a miracle.